to the Week 11 review of the 2025 season, and let's go ahead and dive on in. This week we get tightening of the conference races, and we're going to talk about each of them just a little bit. In this episode, we're going to see some conference race updates, the SEC moving a step closer to Atlanta, the Big Ten and the games that almost were. The Big 12 finally plays a meaningful game. It really should be the G7. Does anybody really want to win the ACC? We'll talk about some metrics a little bit. We will give a look at the current heavily biased top 10 following week 11. We'll talk conference ranks with some contenders, and we will finish out with a ranking speculation since I'm recording this on a Sunday night, and we are 2 days away from this week's release. So let's go ahead and dive on in. So the top two teams won in the SEC this week, and that would be Texas A&M and Alabama. They are both now sitting at 6-0 in the SEC and heading towards their last couple of games. Alabama with a couple of good tiebreakers. Texas A&M going into some interesting games through the next couple of weeks. Neither one of them are through and solid to the SEC championship game right now. There is still a lot of wiggle room in this conference because there are a lot of good teams in here, and there's a lot that can go disastrously wrong. Texas A&M played a very tough Missouri team. Missouri down a little bit from what they have been in the middle of the season. Their loss to Vanderbilt was incredibly costly, not just in the fact that it was a loss, but it also lost their starting quarterback, which has a really big impact. You're throwing a true freshman in there against one of the top teams, one of the best pass rushers in the nation, and it showed at a very meaningful time. I thought Missouri really went for things in a good way. They were aggressive about their play call. They tried to pick up a fourth down when they could have kicked a field goal. They've got a very good field goal kicker and left 3 points on the board pretty early, and that really started to bite them. Because as the half wound down, instead of it being a closer game than it was, that's where kind of that defensive line took over. They got a fumble, Texas A&M scored, and really kind of ran away with the game from that point. In Alabama's game against LSU, again, I think LSU is a very talented team that has very, very much underperformed this year. Kind of as evidence, they have fired Brian Kelly along the way. LSU showed up and played a very solid game. And played a very solid game plan with a talented group. Alabama was kept from some of their normal offensive production, but still, in the end, both found a way to put the game away on defense and did a great job at the end of making the offensive plays when it counted. Both securing a field goal to get themselves a 2-score advantage, and then following that, once they got the ball back, again, their defense playing well, stripped the ball out, caused the turnover, and then their offense picked up a key first down to stay on the field and just be able to bleed the clock out on their own terms. Both of these are playing very well. I think there's still some room to grow in both of them and are in the best spot you could be in at 6-0. Georgia is a game back. Now, Georgia, it's important to note that Georgia also closes out their conference slate early because they do play their rivalry game against Georgia Tech in the final week instead of playing in conference. South Carolina also plays Clemson in that week. There's a few others like that kind of shift away from conference play, but that's kind of one of those beauties of an 8-game conference schedule at times. You'll get some dud games in Game 11 when you play out of conference against the nobody specials, but you also do get some interesting rivalry games at the end of the season. Georgia's 6-1. Their remaining conference game is Texas, and so that's going to be a really interesting one for them. Realistically, I think Georgia only needs to split Georgia Tech and Texas to secure themselves a playoff spot, and it really doesn't matter which way that happens. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how that plays. I do think that they would prefer to play at home, and they're in a decent spot to do it as long as they don't wind up chasing at 10-2. Ole Miss is 5-1 in conference. They're a game back of conference play from Georgia Tech because they did play their last non-conference game this week. They still have Mississippi State on their schedule, as well as one more who I cannot remember at the time. Florida. But Florida, be interesting to see what they put on the field. Florida got just absolutely hammered by Kentucky this week. Texas has got some room to grow. That's the last of the X1s in here. And as you can see, there's a pretty wide spread when we talk about Georgia being 6-1, Texas being 4-1. What we wind up with here, because Texas is 4-1, is that they have 3 games left, all in conference, and that's Georgia, Arkansas, and Texas A&M. Now, Arkansas doesn't have a conference win. That's going to be kind of the middle trap game of the group. But Georgia, as we said above, very, very strong, very good team that will play you hard and wait for you to blink. And Texas A&M, obviously one of the top 3 teams right now. They've got a real slate to go with. If Texas comes out and plays strong, that's a team that we're going to look at as putting something together that was special enough to make a run to the playoff. If they don't, then, well, hey, also ran. Texas also holds tie-breaking games in a couple of important places. Vandy and Oklahoma, chiefly because those are a couple of other SEC teams that are vying for playoff spots. And so should it come down to it where they have similar records, Texas would go ahead of both of those. The Big Ten. As I said last week, there's really nothing to watch for barring an upset. Ohio State played Purdue, took care of business. Nothing at all interesting about that game in the slightest. Indiana nearly gave you a crash course on how not to deal with success. They were spotted 10 points in this game. I mean, legitimately spotted 10 points in this game. Penn State fumbled the ball away with under 4 minutes in the half. Indiana scores to make it a 17-7 halftime lead. And then immediately Penn State immediately throws an interception with the next possession and spots them a field goal. Then turns that into a ball game for no good reason. Winds up taking a lead that Indiana is only going to retake at the very, very end of the game. And if you have any kind of a better throw, Penn State ties this thing because they drove down and missed a throw that would have set them at about the Indiana 20 with plenty of time to kick a potential game-tying field goal. Keep in mind, this is a Penn State team that has yet to win a Big Ten game this year. Picked as one of the favorites for the Big Ten championship, picked as one of the favorites to return to the national playoff. They have fired James Franklin in the middle of this. I mean, they're 0-6 in conference and, still talented, but absolutely took Indiana to the wire and did so with not anything in their tank. The rest of the conference is kind of a mess, and why I've been leaning towards 3 spots with this conference is that Oregon's kind of got an inside track. They did take a last-minute win over Iowa. Iowa was leading this game until 38 seconds to play with an Oregon field goal. And Oregon was able to hang on. Now, that is about their second win over a team with a winning record. They have not played a tough schedule so far. They do have a couple of bigger games on their schedule because they have both Washington and USC remaining. And so we're going to see what this Oregon team is really made of. Their big test so far, they failed it. They've lost it. That was Indiana. And as much as I don't really think that highly of Indiana, that was easily Oregon's biggest test, and they came up short. Their second biggest one here was Iowa. They just barely pulled this out. USC is very much alive. They are in a position with a win over Michigan head-to-head. Washington bowed out this week as they gave Wisconsin their first conference win, and that's going to put them completely out of the playoff race. So that means that your contenders in this are now Indiana, Ohio State at the top, with Oregon kind of your next one up. USC is still alive. Michigan is still alive. Michigan needs a little bit of help and to win out. They went out there in a position where they've beaten Ohio State, and that's going to be a big boost to them, but we'll see how that goes. Let's move on. The Big 12. After this weekend's game between Texas Tech and BYU, they now have a trio at the top. So all of these are X1s. They're not quite the same record because Texas Tech is a game ahead, but they, in the Big 12, do close out the remainder of their season in conference play. So Texas Tech will get, I guess, a week off in the midst of that. Texas Tech beating BYU and not playing Cincinnati means that the Cincinnati versus BYU game, all things equal, will be for the other side of that championship game. So this can be a very simple equation, or depending on how the Big 12 goes, who knows? There could very easily be 3 or 4 teams sitting there with 2 losses, and you have to send one of them to play Texas Tech. I was very impressed with how Texas Tech handled BYU. That has been a fairly strong Cougar squad most of the season, and that game was never close. I tuned to something else while it was still 0 on the board for BYU, and it never became anything other than a Texas Tech blowout. That said, this is still probably a 2-team league at best, just based on who is likely to get into this Big 12 championship game. And the best case scenario for the league would be that it is Texas Tech versus BYU. Yeah. ACC. Seriously, this should be a G7 talk. The rest of the Big 12, let me back up a step. The problem that I've always had with the Big 12, and I will say this until proven otherwise, is that the top of the Big 12 is not that far from the middle. It's great for parity. It's fun to watch sometimes. The top is not that far from the middle, and the middle is indistinguishable from the bottom. You have a couple of bad teams in the Big 12, chiefly this year Colorado and Oklahoma State. And then beyond that, everybody else has a decent chance most any given weekend of beating take your pick. And we've seen that play out on several occasions, and that is how we are in a position where that team is sitting with 3 teams that are all X1s. That said, the ACC has decided that they want to one-up that game. There are a whole mess of 5-1s, and then Duke just behind at 4-1. Virginia failed to hold off Wake Forest, scored 3 field goals, and that was it. Wake Forest returned to punt 88 yards for a touchdown, and that's the only touchdown of the game. So Virginia, with the opportunity clearly to kind of put themselves in position to go, they win this game and they're 1 game away from the ACC championship. And nope, not going to do that. They're actually not the favorite in another one of their games, so this could very well be kind of the start of their slide. We'll see what happens with them, but that was a game they were favored to win. There's another on their schedule that they are not, and we'll see how this goes. Georgia Tech and Pitt, who are both also X1s, are idle this week. SMU, who is an X1, these are all 5-1s. Took down Boston College. Great. Who hasn't? Boston College has won maybe a couple of games all season. The weird part here is Duke. Duke is 5-4. They are 0-3 out of conference. They are 4-1 in conference. They lost this week to UConn. This is a better UConn team than what it's been in several years, but this is not a conference game. Duke is still very much alive in this conference race. They've got a couple of key tiebreakers, and they're in a position where they've got some games left against, I think, Virginia among them, that can put them in a mix where they are sitting at 7-1. They're favored in the remainder of their games, and so it's not outside the realm of possibility at all to see them in that position, which would be a real hassle for the league, because if they were to get to 7 wins in the league, those would be 7 of their 8. and you would be looking at an 8-4 team that has a split of the number one spot. Louisville bowed out of that little race. They dropped to Cal in overtime. When I say that it feels like a league that nobody wants to win, Louisville kicked a game-tying field goal at the start of the fourth quarter. The two teams went on to exchange 7 punts in the remainder of the fourth quarter. There were 7 more meaningful possessions after Louisville kicked the game-tying field goal before the clock ran out on their final drive. Louisville kicked a field goal in overtime after going minus 6 yards, and Cal walked it down for a touchdown, albeit on fourth down. But Cal went ahead and went for the win on a 4th and 3 and got it. And so Louisville drops to 2 losses in conference and really out of the picture as far as the ACC playoffs, or not as far as the ACC playoff race. There's only going to be one. But as far as the ACC championship race, Louisville really kind of dropped back because I don't see there being 2 teams that come in with 2 losses. So, metrics matter. One of the things I looked at when I'm doing the rankings, and we'll see those next, is strength of schedule and victory record, 2 things that I talked about last week. Last week's strength of schedule, Georgia and Ohio State were tied. Ohio State had a couple of losses among the teams that they had played. Georgia had a couple of big wins among the teams that they had played. The new leader in both of those metrics is Georgia. They both won. More of Georgia's opponents won. Now, the final rankings do get adjusted. They reflect things like key losses. They reflect things like the head-to-head record. And so you're not going to see Georgia sitting at number 1 in the rankings as a result. But just do know that in a lot of cases where that happens, I do look at these and try and kind of figure out, within reason, where do I place teams and how do I place teams. Metrics also matter for things like self-scouting. Teams use them to look at themselves. Teams use them to look at their opponents. They're not always perfect. Right now, Arkansas, winless in the SEC, couple wins on the year. I believe they're sitting at 2-7. They are a top 10 offense when it comes to yards per game. Now, that's a kind of ridiculous statistic because there's only 2 teams that will be in our top 10 that are ahead of them. Those 2 teams are Texas Tech and Ole Miss. And to think that somehow a 2-7 team is that far up the list for offense feels kind of crazy. Coming into this week, you could have said the same thing for defense, where there were only 3 teams that had given up less than 24 points every single game. And those 3 teams were Indiana, Ohio State, and Auburn. Now, Auburn, 38 in regulation against Vandy this week, gave up 45 in total and losing in overtime. But coming into the week, here's a team that's sub 500 with the 3rd best scoring defense as far as points as far as not having allowed 24 points in a game. And yet, offense was so bad for them that they had lost so many of them. Arkansas, 15th worst defense. One of the top 10 offenses, one of the bottom 15 defenses. But it also helps for finding tendencies, for finding how your opponents do things, for finding how you do things, how to break some of those tendencies, especially in situations where you want to try and confuse an opponent's defense or offense, and to do some things where you're attacking defenses and offenses. Do you have a defense that blitzes heavily? Do they utilize their corners and safeties in those blitz packages? Do they stretch themselves in a way that leaves them vulnerable to stretching the field wide? Do they leave themselves vulnerable in a way that stretches the field deep? In the writing part of this, I looked at Oklahoma and Alabama. Oklahoma had the week off. They watched LSU play Alabama. They watched a very good LSU defense play against Alabama and hold them to 20 points. Albeit Alabama missed a field goal and had a couple of different places where they got stopped in the red zone. Somewhat uncharacteristically, as far as the remainder of their season has gone. Alabama's success rate in the red zone has been very high most of the year. That said, if I'm sitting in Oklahoma's position, they have a top 10 run defense, or they have a top 10 total defense. Their run defense being just a little better than their pass defense. Um, However, Alabama's rushing offense is really not that exciting. Um, Alabama's passing offense is really where they do most of their ball control. They tend to work a little bit more of the middle of the field, and the middle of the field in shorter routes. Uh, if I'm Oklahoma, I am selling out on my underneath routes, working to let my defensive line win battles up front and try and secure the running game so that they are not able to just break tendency and gash us with that. And I am going to dare Alabama to throw deep. Not because I don't think their receivers are capable of it, but because Alabama has one of the lowest rates of a top 10 team of throwing and completing deep balls. Uh, Going into last week, they were in the bottom third as far as attempts, and they were in the bottom quarter as far as completions of passes of 30 or more air yards. And so you have a really soft spot in how their offense plays. And if I'm setting a defense, that's probably how I attack it, is to say that you throw deep. If you want to beat us and you want to gash us with big plays, you go right ahead, but we're not going to let you sustain drives. And, for Alabama, that might be what you're looking at, is to see if you put in some packages that expect Oklahoma to sell out underneath and to put them in positions where, taking away one of the underneath routes leaves you open for a deep shot and work it. You also could work your running attack and put yourself in a position where you're breaking tendency and actually moving the ball with the run. Be that through jet sweep actions, be that through a lot of other things. Self-scouting, metrics matter. Let's go ahead and look at the heavily biased top 10. 1 through 5. This week I've jumped Texas A&M back to number 1. Again, the metrics kind of played this out. Texas A&M's schedule playing Missouri is a more impactful game, and winning a top 25 game on the road, something that Ohio State has not had to do, and winning not their first top 25 game on the road. The talent gap probably favors Ohio State. The resume favors Texas A&M. Number 2, Ohio State, same thing. The metrics caught them this week. Last week they came kind of even as far as wins go. This week, a lot of those opponents took losses. These two are really, really close when it comes down to. I think the better team on the field is probably Ohio State. The better team on the paper right now is probably Texas A&M as far as the metrics go of who they have played. Alabama is a very, very, very close second to Ohio State in that, or very close to second and Ohio State in that. Georgia's strength schedule is actually ahead of Ohio State's, but the Georgia win, the win in Athens for Alabama, is still better than anything on Indiana's schedule. This win over LSU is better than what Indiana put up against Penn State. Indiana's schedule took a bunch of losses because they played a bunch of the back end of the conference, and they will play a bunch of the back end of the conference. The remainder of their schedule is against teams that are at the bottom of the Big Ten. That's important because right now I'm in a position where Indiana's 4, Georgia's 5. If Georgia is to beat Texas and wind up in a position where they are 11-1, that's enough for me to move Georgia ahead of Indiana. They've lost to Alabama head up, and so they're not going to pass them with the same record. However, given a one-loss Georgia team and a undefeated Indiana team and the schedule the two of them have had to play to get there, that's Georgia every time. Number 6, Ole Miss. A little worse schedule, locked behind Georgia on head-to-head, but a lot better schedule than number 7, and that's Texas Tech. big win over BYU. Really looked impressive in that game. They are a near lock for the Big 12 championship game. After that, it becomes a really tight grouping. 8 through 11, there's minimal separation between them. And I went ahead and put that in the slide if you're looking at that. If not, I'm going to just talk through it real quick. Oregon is the only team among these 4 teams that has 1 loss. And those 4 teams are Oregon, Texas, Oklahoma, and Notre Dame. Texas has a worse loss than either of the things that Notre Dame has. They lost to the Florida team that has kind of fallen apart of late. I would say that Miami has done a little bit better than what Florida has done. The Texas A&M loss, I'm not really holding that far against them. But, that's because I've got the number 1 team. They've got the best loss out there right now. They've gotten an impressive run, Notre Dame has, but it's against the weaker portion of their schedule. They've got a couple of teams left that are okay, and we'll see where that goes. But, this is also a team that has a win against Boston College, and some others like that are just awful. Speaking of Texas and Oklahoma, Texas has the head-to-head win. Their 2 losses are better. Or their 2 losses are to... their 2 losses are not better than what happens with Notre Dame. Notre Dame is, they've lost to better teams. They just don't have a signature win. And that's the big thing kicking them right now is that, they didn't beat Texas. They lost, games that they could have won in other places. And that really is keeping them back. Right now, Texas 8, Oklahoma 9. I've got Notre Dame in at 10. And then the 1-loss team, the only one of the group with 1 loss, and the worst schedule of the group, Oregon at the bottom at 11. Going to do a thing here real quick. We wrapped up last episode with a reaction to the first college football playoff rankings. Those are due out on Tuesday. I'm recording this on Sunday. I'm going to talk through what I think the upcoming rankings are. Now, granted, that's the committee rankings, not mine. Mine are a little bit different, and I have told you why. And mine usually are a little bit different because I look at metrics a little bit differently than they do. But this is what I think you're going to see when we see about the top 18 teams come Tuesday. After we talk about conference rankings. This week, I've got a lot of things pretty much the same. I've got the SEC at 4.4. I think that they are they're pretty much a lock to put in 4 teams. They might put in a 5th. It'll just depend on how some games go. And the contenders there, Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas, Oklahoma, and Vandy. The Big Ten, I've got them at 3.3. About a 30% chance to put in their 4th team. Ohio State and Indiana are virtual locks. Oregon is kind of next up, and then the battle kind of comes down to Oregon, USC, and Michigan, with Michigan being somewhat the outsider there with a loss to USC and a game against Ohio State to play. The Big 12, 1.7, and really that matters who winds up playing in that Big 12 championship. I don't think there's a second spot if Cincinnati winds up playing in that thing, but BYU, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, or a chaos champion. And if it's a chaos champion, that's all there is. ACC, 1.1. This is the chances of them putting a second team in are diminishing every week. Right now, Virginia still has one of the best records in the conference, but a lot of teams are kind of right there with them. Virginia and Georgia Tech are kind of tied in that regard. I just think that Georgia Tech is likely to wind up losing one of these games, especially with Georgia still on their schedule. You still have the very real possibility of a chaos champion in that league. One spot, maybe a second if the rest of everybody else just falls flat. G5, right now it's the AAC champion still. We'll see how that goes. But one spot's all you're getting. And then Notre Dame, I've got about a 50% chance to make it. That will jump significantly should they get by Pitt. And we'll see that game coming up shortly. All right, ranking prediction. Ohio State, I think, holds on to the number 1 spot. I think Texas A&M and Indiana flip. Texas A&M had an impressive game against a ranked Missouri team. Indiana had to stretch to beat a unranked and no conference wins Penn State team. I think those two flop the 2 and 3 spots. Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss all hold their spots at 4, 5, and 6. Alabama's got the head-up win against Georgia. Georgia's got the head-up win against Ole Miss. I don't think there's any motion there. I also don't think that Texas Tech breaks that bubble. I don't think that they push past and get past Ole Miss to the 6th spot. Even though they did win the highest-ranked game of the week against BYU, I don't think that that pushes them to number 6. And that's important because that means that that bubble of 4 SEC teams ahead of the first Big 12 team still holds. I don't think, even though I rank them much lower than this, I don't think that Oregon drops off of Texas Tech's heels. They were right there with the Texas Tech, BYU, and Oregon in lockstep with one another last week. Iowa was 20th. It's a ranked game. They won it. So I think that they probably wind up holding on to that spot right on Texas Tech's backside, where they are going to jump to the 8th spot. Notre Dame creeps up 1. Texas creeps up 1. Oklahoma creeps up 1. BYU, with their first loss, I dropped by 5 spots to 12. I think Utah, since they have a win head up, is kind of their floor. And that's where I put them, is that I put them ahead of a Utah team that they beat. Utah comes in holding at 13, and they hold off Vandy, Georgia Tech, Miami, USC, and Michigan, who stay with their current spots but move ahead of Virginia and Louisville, who drop out of that top 18. So that's my prediction for where the top 18 go. We will see how that plays out on Tuesday. And I will probably try to put up a reaction video, just a little short, to YouTube and get a little segment look at it. You'll see the primers on the Facebook site on Wednesday. If you have not done so already, I will put links to this, put links to that Facebook group or that Facebook page in the show notes from some of these. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button wherever you're watching this, and we will see you next week.